welcome to the latest edition of Family Matters, and thank you to everyone for the feedback over previous editions. Really appreciate that. Look, today's guest is the director of the Catholic Bioethics Centre, or some of you will know it as the Nathaniel Centre for Bioethics. It's Dr John Kleinsman. Amongst many claims to fame, his doctorate's actually in theology and bioethics. So John, welcome to the show.
Kia ora, Simon. Thank you. Pleasure to be with you.
Hey, really good to have you on. We're going to mainly focus around the ethical questions around euthanasia and physician-assisted suicide. And I say that for listeners because, of course, the areas of not only theology and bioethics are huge. But I wonder if you might just give us, well, like a sort of a quick introduction, if you might. Firstly, what is bioethics? There'll be some people there going, I don't fully appreciate what that is. We'll take it as given they know what theology is. But talk us through generally what is bioethics, and then just tell us a little bit about the work that you lead as the director there at the Nathaniel Centre.
Sure. So the word bioethics comes from two Greek words, bios, meaning life, and ethics, which of course has to do with ethical matters, decision-making. So bioethics in general is the discipline which really looks at all of the questions, the moral and ethical questions that are generated by life issues. So that's from the beginning of life to the end of life. It emerged in the sort of 60s and 70s really, but has a long history which goes back into the hospital system that was set up in the Middle Ages and well before then. So its roots go back into the Christian tradition actually, but in its modern usage, the term only emerged in the 1970s. And more recently, it has come to include questions around and related to the climate and the environment. So it's a broad area, bioethics, and becoming more and more complex. I've worked in the area for 25 years, and the issues are becoming more and more complex.
Absolutely, as you say, broadening out too from, if you will, the traditional aspects through into now climate change and obviously the impact that it has on us. Tell us about the work of the Nathaniel Centre before we get into the heavy stuff of euthanasia and PAS.
Sure. The Nathaniel Centre was set up in 1999, so we've just celebrated our 25th anniversary, and it was a response to the emerging complex questions around life, around genetic modification, around the emerging new reproductive technologies. And in the mid-90s, the New Zealand Catholic bishops had numerous requests from different organisations saying that the church really had something to offer and had a voice that needed to be part of this, the debates that were happening around these issues, and that the Catholic Church also needed to have a centre which could respond and formulate and inform its own adherents, Catholics in New Zealand, about what was happening in these different areas. So that's how it's emerged. And over the years, we've engaged in a number of different commissions, including the Genetic Modification or Royal Commission on Genetics, which went back into the early 2000s. Very involved in various laws, in the review and in the setup of the HEART Act, the Human Assisted Reproductive Technology Act, which is a particular interest of mine because that's the area in which I did my PhD. And of course, been heavily involved in different pieces of legislation to do with the reform of abortion and prior to that, the introduction of legalised assisted dying in New Zealand. We were very involved in that debate as well.
So clearly just a very relaxed, easy life, nothing particularly heavy to deal with.
Yeah.
Look, a huge respect for the work you do. I've known you for many years and first and foremost grateful for that leadership that you've provided across an incredibly wide area. Obviously today we're going to focus more in the whole euthanasia, physician-assisted suicide, but I wonder, we should put our respective academic hats on, particularly you with a doctorate, to actually tell people what's the difference between euthanasia and physician-assisted suicide, and then let's just explore some of the ethical issues around that. So, yeah, what is the distinction between these two, euthanasia and PAS?
Well, euthanasia is not a new word, of course, and it also goes back to two Greek words, and it literally means a good death, which is what we all want. In more recent times, it has in some ways been captured by the pro-assisted dying lobby and has come to mean an assisted death, if I could use that terminology. There are two types of assisted death, and the law in New Zealand, the End of Life Choice Act, in fact, allows for both euthanasia and assisted suicide. And the difference between those two is that with assisted suicide, the medical profession will give the person the means by which they can end their own life. Euthanasia, or medical assisted dying, is where the doctor, a medical professional, could be anyone, but in New Zealand the law it restricts it to doctors, in fact will end the life of the person through an intervention such as the administration of a lethal dosage or a lethal injection. So that's the difference, that's the distinction between the two types of assisted death that we have in New Zealand. Interestingly, when you look at different regimes around the world, there are a number, particularly in the US, there are a number of states who allow a form of assisted death, which is technically assisted dying. And the numbers of people who avail themselves of assisted suicide, or that form of assisted death, is much, much less than those countries which allow both euthanasia and assisted suicide.
Yeah, and it's one of the key elements that New Zealand has both. As you're mentioning and alluding to, a lot of countries have only one option. We've actually allowed both. And of course, part of the context of our discussion today is that New Zealand is reviewing its euthanasia law. I would suggest euphemistically named the End of Life Choice Act. But I mean, going really wide to start, I mean, what are the main, if you will, ethical considerations or issues with euthanasia or physician-assisted suicide? And I better just say for listeners, I'm probably just going to use the term euthanasia more often than not to capture both types. Otherwise, it becomes quite wordy. But yeah, what are the main objections to euthanasia from your own work and study as a bioethicist?
Well, let's start with the name of the Act, End of Life Choice Act. It should be a choice. And one of the realities of the current context in which we find ourselves, the 21st century in Aotearoa, New Zealand, is that palliative care, good, effective, quality palliative care, is not equitably available. And one of the real fears that I have, and this came out extensively in the lead up to the legislation or the legalisation of euthanasia, is that if it is to be a choice for people, then they need to have a real choice between quality palliative care and deciding to end their life in a premature way, whether they do that themselves or ask the doctor to do it. So that we know that isn't the case in New Zealand at the moment. And in recent weeks, unfortunately, we've seen how there has been a lot of debate and a lot of controversy around the state of our health system. North of Auckland, Northland, huge issues there with the hospital and the staffing of the hospital where they can't get doctors. So in that sort of context, it's not necessarily going to be a choice. Assisted dying, euthanasia, is fully funded in New Zealand, and palliative care is still largely relies on the goodness of people and the willingness of hospices to actually fundraise, most of which they do by way of hospice shops. So it's not a fully funded service and it's not equitably available. So it can't be a real choice until people have that equal choice. So that's the first point that I would say. The second point that I would make is that every assisted dying law is premised on the principle that there are some lives that are no longer worth living. And that is a huge Rubicon that we crossed the minute that euthanasia became legal in New Zealand. So the law questions the worth of certain people. If you have and meet the criteria of the End of Life Choice Act, and there are criteria, then we now have a state-sanctioned law which says that we will accept that you may want to end your life. So this idea of human dignity is challenged, or certainly the Catholic idea of what I would call infinite dignity or intrinsic dignity is challenged by the current law. Intrinsic dignity or infinite dignity, to quote from a new document that was recently put out by the Dicastery for the Doctrine of the Faith, was published in April, is based on this idea that every life is worth living and that human dignity is non-negotiable. It's not limited or shaped by our circumstances or how others may see us or value us, or how we may see or value ourselves. Whereas, as I've said before, philosophically speaking, assisted dying is based on this idea that some lives are negotiable, at which point dignity itself, human dignity itself, has become negotiable. And that changes from a philosophical and ethical point of view, that changes the whole context and the way in which we start to think about people who live lives that we would say are perhaps less than optimal. And that includes the disability sector, or people who are disabled. Those are probably the two key issues for me that I would say at this point in time.
Well, let's tease both of those out, starting with choice, because I mean that's the go-to word or concept, certainly of today's society, that I need to be able to make my choices, my decisions, and really the objection is who should be limiting the choices that I make. But I suppose what you're saying is that our choices are actually, if you will, naturally limited in and around society, and a big part of it is the information we're getting. I mean, I might just use an example which you'll be familiar with, which I think illustrates how choices can be confused or limited. Was a New Zealander recently who was given someone else's diagnosis of a terminal illness and told that she only had a few weeks to live. And so she started exploring options, including euthanasia. And then it was discovered that, in fact, it was the wrong diagnosis. But, this false information was immediately affecting her choices. And then around this, you've also mentioned the likes of hospice, palliative care. It's pretty much not funded by government. It's quite a postcode lottery, as in, here in Auckland or in Wellington or Christchurch, you probably can get some choice. But if you live in, Ekatahuna or Porirua or wherever else, it's not so difficult, or not so easy. So really, our choices as humans are not as free and open as those who are supporting euthanasia would make out. Would that be right?
Oh, look, absolutely. And our choices are always constrained. The other point is that as a society, in the interests of the common good and the interests of being able to live together, we do limit the choices of individuals. We do that in all sorts of ways. A basic example, of course, is the speed limits that we impose on the open roads. Now, there are numerous drivers in New Zealand, I wouldn't necessarily include myself in those, people like Greg Murphy, who could probably drive at 160 k's quite safely, but many people can't. So we impose limits on people for all sorts of reasons, for the common good, for the benefit of society. So this idea that of unlimited autonomy is in fact a fallacy. I also think one of the risks of an overemphasis on autonomy and individual choice, which is, I think, a feature of the neoliberal worldview in which we exist. It gives priority to individuals, it gives priority to choice. One of the problems of that is that it hides some of the questions which we would want to ask about the impact of our choices on other people. So I think most people would think about euthanasia in terms of, well, it's my body, it's my life, and if I decide I want to shorten my life, well, what is the problem with that? How is that going to negatively affect other people. And that, I think, is a point of difference between the approach that the Catholic tradition and others would take to this issue and others. So what we in particular would argue is that none of us make choices in isolation, that choices happen within a particular context. And I would say choices happen within a particular narrative. And we don't always, or we need to, I think, ask the questions about the impact of our choices on other people. And I think the impact of legalizing euthanasia is quite significant, but not necessarily well understood or not necessarily well explored in a context in which autonomy is given almost free rein, if I could use that phrase.
Yeah, well, it's always struck me, John, that at one level, as I say, none of us are making, and maybe this is more of a statement, so feel free to push against it, but none of us are really acting autonomously. We are always influenced in some way, shape or form. And I would personally even make the argument that when someone is certainly facing a terminal illness, particularly early on, there's a lot of depressive elements which we know are present, which is clouding judgment. But the other two is my autonomous decisions. If I choose, to end my life, there's a family around there. And we know from research and anecdotes overseas that many family members struggle afterwards. Did they make the right decision? Should they have given mum or dad another day or two? There's it can be an ongoing trauma, which again indicates that, there isn't just this sole autonomous individual making decisions that only affect them.
Mm-hmm. No, I think you're quite right about that. Having said that, Simon, I mean, there are families for whom the premature death or the assisted death of a parent or a loved one would seem anyway to have brought them some form of release and relief. So it's not true to say that in every case there is necessarily issues involved with complex grief, which is a term that is often used, but certainly there is some research which shows that for many families, the experience of an assisted death is added to the trauma of their grief. That is in fact well established.
Yeah, and there'll be a range of approaches from those families, I'm sure, who are very happy. Look, I've darkly said sometimes where there's a will, there's a family. In other words, there can be those pressures which family are putting on loved ones. We've certainly seen a lot of times, and I've seen it in recent months, actually. I've been visiting the hospital because of family members and talking to a lot of others in the hospital. A lot of sick people, I'm thinking particularly in the oncology ward here, John, who are feeling a burden. It's one of the things which I think, maybe we should touch on a little bit. People who feel they are a burden to their family or to the health system and so forth. And so they begin to, my terminology here, but they begin to erode their own dignity. So is that moment, particularly of terminal illness, are there things in play that you've seen within the bioethical space which ultimately is affecting their ability to be autonomous? Again, if they feel that they're a burden, if they are depressed, are these things that we need or does New Zealand take that seriously enough? Does the current law factor that in any way?
Look, when we think about coercion, and it is an important question, and it was something that was actually debated at length during the passage of the law through Parliament. But most people think about coercion as something that is overt. They think about family members who might be pressuring, for example, a parent to end their life prematurely. And there are numerous examples overseas and some emerging in New Zealand where certainly financial issues are a factor in the choices and in the pressure that some people are feeling. That's what I would call overt coercion. And I'm not sure that our law actually deals with that as well as it could. There is a website run by Defend New Zealand which has the title 6 to Fix, and one of the points they make there is that there is no formal assessment or requirement of a formal assessment for people to check coercion or whether they're being coerced. So that's the question of overt coercion, and yes, our law is weak in that. But I think the bigger risk for me, the bigger danger, and the bigger concern is what I would say is the covert coercion. And look, it's readily apparent to me and to lots of people that we live in a very ableist society. this idea that we need to be independent, that we need to be productive, that we need to be functional. It's a narrative that has actually come into play and is very, very strong within our society, including within the medical profession. And ableism questions the worth of anyone who is disabled. And it's epitomised by that slogan, which you will have heard, I'm sure, and our listeners will have heard, that it's better to be dead than disabled. So that's a strong part of our culture in New Zealand. It hasn't always been like that. And I think that creates what I would call a covert form of coercion. And look, to take this down to a personal level, reflecting on the story of my own dad, who lived with us for the last 2.5 years of his life, and who was given a life-limiting illness, or a diagnosis of a life-limiting illness. He had liver cancer. Through that time, he often said to me out of frustration, look, I'm a burden. I wish I could, I didn't have to be a burden for you. I can see the imposition this is on your life, the impact it's having on you as a family. Now, he was not someone who supported euthanasia in principle, but he had at one level bought into that covert idea of the ableist narrative that if we're not functioning, if we're not independent, if we're not in control of our lives, then somehow our life isn't worth living. And that is, I think, a fallacy, a dangerous fallacy. And it was very much at the core of the arguments that were used and that were presented in Parliament to argue for the need for an assisted dying law in New Zealand. If I could, sort of quote from the from parliamentary discussion, and it was Louisa Wall who argued that Lucretia Seales wanted to choose the point to end of life because of the indignity of the disabilities that were associated with her illness. And quote, she couldn't care for herself, she couldn't go to the toilet, people had to look after her, it was degrading for her. That, I think, shows the extent to which the ableist narrative has taken hold in New Zealand. And at the time, I wrote a response to that and made the point that the need that people have for help with bathing and toileting on a daily basis is actually an integral part of the lives of many people with disabilities. And I've worked in the disability sector for 10 years myself. And if, as Louisa Wall suggested at the time, this is seen as degrading, and if such a loss of dignity is worse than death, which is what an assisted law is actually saying, then in many, if not most people's minds, assisted dying sends a message to all disabled people that they would be better off dead. That is the sort of covert coercion that I am talking about. And I think it is really, really dangerous. So this idea that we think we would be better off dead, that we can't be a burden. Within the sort of the ableist story, the cardinal sin, if I could use that theological term, is to be dependent on somebody else. If you look at the statistics collected by Oregon, and they've collected statistics over 20 years, the key reasons that people give for wanting an assisted death are all existential. It's not about uncontrollable pain. We know that hospice care, good quality palliative care, can actually control that. The reasons have to do with the loss of enjoyment of living, the loss of control of life, the loss of autonomy. These are all existential reasons, and this is why people are choosing it.
And I think really, well, jumping onto a few things there, that existential side's really important to emphasise, that we've seen, from what we can detect in New Zealand, because there's such limited reporting, certainly what we've seen overseas, and just to really emphasise what you've said to listeners, it's not the pain, it's that sense of worth or value, that second key point that you were touching on. The other thing I was struck by, and it's in that disability space, the implicit and then explicit messages given to our disabled neighbours, and we've all got friends in that space that, yeah, their lives aren't as valuable. When someone says, I don't want to clean myself or have to get assistance to be toileted, all of these things, as you say, life's not worth living, I'd be better off dead. That's making one hell of a statement to our disabled sector. And I've been struck over the years how many disabled people feel devalued. And there's that unfortunate, I don't like slippery slope arguments. I suspect with your work in bioethics you don't either, but it's that, you really shouldn't be alive is almost the message that's going to some of our disabled community. I mean, do you want to just tease a little bit further on to that space at what you have seen and heard in the disabled sector?
Yeah, look, absolutely. There's a quote that comes to mind from a nurse called Nancy Valco, which I think I might have here. And I thought she summed that argument up really, really well. Do assisted death supporters really expect us doctors and nurses to be able to assist in the premature death of one patient, then go on to care for a similar patient who wants to live without this having an effect on our ethics or our empathy? And do they realise that this reduces the second patient's will to live request to a mere personal whim, perhaps ultimately one that society will see as selfish and too costly? And one of the arguments that I've run numerous times over the years is that the right to die very quickly becomes a duty to die, that people feel like they somehow have to justify the fact that they want to continue living, knowing that it is posing a certain financial burden as well as an emotional burden on family. But this goes back to what we understand it means to be human and what distinguishes us and characterizes us as human persons. And for me, it is about that ability to care for other people. We are not simply functionaries. We are not simply people who are there to be in control. There doesn't always have to be a point to life. People will say, well, what's the point of living? What's the point of continuing to live when we have an illness or when we are disabled? That is such a dangerous line to run. Because we then find ourselves in a position where we start to judge the worth of human beings. That's what any assisted dying law does. It changes the whole context, because once we make allowance, or once we allow for this idea that certain lives are not worth living, then we start to look at other people and say, well, why are you still alive? And then the ultimate, I think, coercion is when people themselves, and you've just hinted at this, Simon, when people themselves start to question their own right to live. So it's not as if the coercion is necessarily coming from doctors or family, but they have taken on that idea that their right to life is somehow premised on the fact that they are not a burden or are able to be independent. And like I say, I think that's very, very dangerous. I was struck by a story some months ago whereby they uncovered the remains of a prehistoric human being, and it was obvious that this child had a severe disability. They could actually tell that from an analysis of the bone structure and whatever. And there was a lot of publicity and a lot of excitement around the fact that hundreds of thousands of years ago, our earliest ancestors actually showed a willingness to care for those who were severely disabled. And the point was made at the time, because these would have been agrarian societies, they were possibly people who were on the move, that the parents or the mother of that child would only have been able to do that with the active support of the other members of her tribe or of her family. So a lot was made of that, quite rightly. And I think it highlights for me what is a characteristic part of what it is to be human. We care for each other. That's what makes us human. That's part of what it is flourishing. And so the question I think that is not often asked about assisted death, assisted dying, is what is the impact of this on our ability to care for other people? What is the impact on this of this law on the way in which we relate to those with disabilities, on the way we relate to those who are ill, on the way we relate to those who are disabled or handicapped. And the answer to that, I think, is quite simple. Those people become more and more marginalised by such a law. Whether that's the intention or not, I'm not saying that's intentional, but that is in fact part of the logic of the law, because as I said earlier, it is premised on this idea that there are some lives not worth living.
Yeah, look, again, for what my take on it is, I don't think it is for most an intention, but it's the logical consequence, because it just keeps coming back to, I would define it as a utilitarian approach. Do you bring value to society or not? And sadly, in my opinion, this goes even wider than just the discussion of euthanasia, the way we treat, the homeless or people on welfare and those who are unemployed. What worth are you providing to society? Which I think very utilitarian arguments, very ultimately dangerous, because it's taken away from that core concept we've discussed at the start, which is the human dignity of every person, regardless of their circumstance. But I thought too, it's
and that's the bottom line for a Catholic approach. Yes, this underlying infinite dignity which cannot be challenged, that the worth of people does not change according to their circumstances, according to their illness or whatever. We all share this equal dignity, and assisted dying laws by their very nature actually undermine that principle. If I could give an example of how deeply ingrained this is in our culture, I spend a lot of time working with students in colleges, talking about these and other issues. I get invited in. And I can remember some years ago, and this was after my mother had died, and my father at the time was living on his own. He did that for some 10 years before he came to live with us. And he had a number of conditions, including peripheral neuropathy and quite a serious degeneration of the spine, which made life for him pretty tough, pretty hard. And he was also missing my mum terribly, and in hindsight, I think he was probably depressed after she died, particularly in that first year. And I can remember giving a series of scenarios to these young people. At the time, assisted dying was being debated in New Zealand, but it hadn't actually become law yet, and it wasn't clear whether or not it would. So I gave these young people, year 13s, so what were they, 17, 16, 17, 18-year-olds, gave them a whole lot of scenarios, including the scenario of my father. And the law at the time, the law that was initially presented by David Seymour, you might recall, was a lot broader than what it is now. And the conditions that my dad had would have in fact made him eligible for an assisted death had that law gone through, and it didn't. We saw it was narrowed. I understand that David Seymour did that not because he necessarily appreciated the risks involved, but because he thought it was more likely to get the law over the line if in fact he tightened it up. Anyway, I gave these young...
really quickly, completely pragmatic to get the law through, which is why we're now at a review stage where they're renewing their push to extend this much more widely. But I've broken up your story. Carry on.
Yeah, so anyway, I gave these young 16, 17-year-olds a whole host of scenarios, probably about 20 in all, and I'd said to them, you have to think of yourselves as being part of this committee, which is going to approve or not approve these different cases. And my dad's scenario was in there. I didn't identify it as my dad. And I think of the students who were there, probably 80% of them thought that the scenario relating to my dad was a realistic one and was a reasonable one for him to qualify and for him to be eligible for an assisted death. So they gave him the tick. They said, yeah, that they thought that was reasonable. And then I said to them, hey, I just want to unpack this a little bit more. Here, this story actually relates to my dad. And I told them a little bit more about my dad and what he was able to achieve and what he did in those years after my mum died, and they weren't easy years. Weddings of my kids, the graduation of two of my children at university, 21st celebrations. He went back to Holland to visit family some 3 or 4 years after my mum died. So in fact, his life was far from over, and there were these series of celebrations and things that he did, which in their minds, his life wasn't worth living. So again, I tell this story just to emphasize how deeply ingrained this idea of ableism is in our culture, which I think is what makes the assisted dying law particularly dangerous. And at this point in time, as we're considering reviewing the law, I know there are a lot of people who are already pushing for a much, much broader law.
And I think, again, I think it's not just in the dying space. The value of people is being critiqued almost every day now to, what value do you give society, or what value do you give to me? It's sort of almost this bizarre self-centeredness which then judges everyone else. It's quite, I'll use the word insidious. It's quite a dangerous mindset, and very at odds, as you say, on that particular that Catholic notion of absolute innate human dignity throughout. And the other point, if I might quickly, you touched on that duty, the duty to die. And please critique me on this, but I think listeners need to understand it's not a doctor or a nurse or some expert walking up to someone and saying, you must die. There'll be some instances of that, but more often than not, it's just the messaging which someone is picking up, and they feel that it therefore is their duty. I suppose the final point, if we could touch on, is this whole notion that it is expanding, or there's a push to expand euthanasia and physician-assisted suicide. And, as we've talked here about utilitarianism, about this existential pressure on people, it sort of seems inevitable if once you've bought into the concept of euthanasia that it will expand. And I was talking to Professor Theo Bohr. You'll know Theo very well. He talked about how the issue of euthanasia, if you will, has moved out of a health space, so I am sick, therefore I need to end my life, to one of justice. Well, it's just my choice. It's the just thing for me to choose what I want. So there's almost a philosophical inevitability that it has to expand, as we've seen in Canada and other places, that if someone just wants to exercise their autonomy, their choice, why shouldn't they be able to? Why should it just be a physical illness? Why not any degenerative disease, mental illness, or so forth? So I just want to talk us through the inevitability in the argument, hopefully not in reality, but once people have accepted that there is this duty to die, that life is really just up to you to decide if there's value, hard to put limits around that, John.
Philosophically speaking, it's impossible. And again, I've said this on a number of occasions, that the conditions or the criteria that currently define our own law are absolutely totally arbitrary. Why limit it to people who only have 6 months to live? Suffering is not something that only happens to people who have 6 months to live. What about people who have 12 months to live, or 18 months, or even longer? Why limit it to people who only have physical illnesses or physical suffering? And you've already alluded to this, but we've seen overseas in the European countries such as Belgium and the Netherlands, and now increasingly also in Canada, the eligibility criteria has been expanded to include people with psychiatric illnesses, people with illnesses such as anorexia. So if it is about suffering, and if it is about choice, then why limit that choice? So the current criteria in our law are totally arbitrary. And philosophically speaking, you can't logically create a robust, coherent argument that says that it should stop at those. There is no rationale for limiting it to 6 months or so. So, that's why I say there is a certain inevitability about the fact that the law will expand, as we've seen it happen in the overseas countries that I've already referred to. And look, excuse me, we know that our own law was influenced significantly by the Canadian law. We're, I think, in a fortunate and privileged position where we can, in fact, see where our own laws will end up, where our own country will end up by looking at what is happening in Canada and where it was gone. It started in exactly the same place that we did, that this was something that needed to be offered to people who had terrible illnesses at the end of life. It's where it started in Holland. Theo Boer, I think, used the phrase "a last resort to prevent a terrible death." And we can see what's happening in Canada. There are people in Canada who fit the criteria, okay, but who are choosing it not because their life is terrible because of the disease, but because of their social conditions, because of a lack of social support. And this includes numbers of people with disabilities. Yes, they fit the criteria, but they don't want to die. But because of a lack of proper accommodation or whatever, they are choosing it for reasons other than their illness. So this is where we will end up. We need to, I think, look very closely at Canada in particular. We, I think, have strong similarities with the Canadian culture, the New Zealand and Canadian culture, apart from the fact that, as I said earlier, our laws are very similar to the Canadian laws. So we're in a position, if I could say even a lucky position, where what is happening in Canada is the crystal ball for us to look at and see where our own laws will go if, in fact, we decide to expand the law in New Zealand, which I desperately hope we won't.
Yeah, it's one of the funny things about New Zealand. I've certainly found with my former political hat on, I'm amazed at how often we are following other countries, and yet we're not, if you will, willing to learn from them. And fundamentally, once you open the door to the concept of euthanasia, which is why people like yourself and I have fought against it so hard, once you open that door, once you cross that line or threshold, it becomes very, very difficult, if not impossible, to then keep it narrow, as you say. I love the word arbitrary. Why 6 months, not 9? Why 9, not 12? Why not this condition, not that condition? Why not a 16-year-old? Why is it magically 18? Better be clear, I'm not arguing for that, but as you say, it's just completely arbitrary. John,
look, you're absolutely right about that. Yeah. And look, if I could.
Oh, please, no, carry on.
Perhaps if I can make one last point, and the point is that euthanasia, in fact, makes logical sense within a particular narrative. And maybe this is me summing up what some of the points that I've made so far this morning. It does make sense within a particular narrative. My concern, though, is that the narrative within which it makes sense is largely an ableist and functionalist narrative. And my own opposition, and in fact, I could probably say that the Catholic opposition to assisted death, and in particular any further expansion of that, it's about much more than just opposing the premature death of people. In fact, I think it's about protecting ourselves from an impoverished, I would call it an impoverished and very reductionist and ableist narrative. So the point of all of this, the point of conflict really is, for me, less about this particular law, which I think is a symptom of the changes that have happened within our society and the shift towards this particular narrative, which I see as being a fundamentally impoverished one. So it's very much about a clash of narratives for me, of which I think this assisted death is a symptom. Maybe that's a good way for me to wrap up some of what we've been talking about and talking around this morning.
Yeah, I think it is, including, and we won't have time to talk about this, but we've touched on it very briefly. Yeah, the thinking behind, if you like, the euthanasia, physician-assisted suicide, does manifest itself in how we as a society treat others less able, be it physical, mental, or otherwise. So it's a big, big challenge to us. John, I'm exceptionally grateful for you making the time to talk us through this. It's an important topic at any point in time, but as we are looking towards a review of the legislation, I think it's even more important. So thank you for coming on the show. Thank you for the work you lead there at the Nathaniel Centre and for the leadership you provide into this bioethical space.
Thank you, Simon. It's a privilege to be interviewed by you, and I hope that this leads some of the listeners or watchers to actually have their own conversations about this very, very important matter. Appreciate your time.
Thanks again.